Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Kilwan Lee, Professor of Law at Sungkyunkwan University Law School. As it was yesterday, I will be the host for the 6th International Conference on the Law of the Sea. First of all, I would like to thank all of you for providing strong interest and support in this conference. Under the title of The Law of the Sea for the Next Generation, Challenges from New Technologies and Environmental Crisis, Session 3 through Session 5 will continue today. Before we begin, I would like to inform you that this conference will be held in a hybrid format. As some of our participants are joining us online, I kindly ask for your understanding on any interruption associated with technical issues. Now, we will begin Session 3 of the 6th International Conference of the Law of the Sea under the topic of Promoting Biodiversity Beyond UNCLOS. Chief Executive Rena Lee, who serves as a chairperson at the BBNJ Intergovernmental Conference, will moderate the session. She is joining us online. Chief Executive, are you there? Can you hear me?
No.
Okay, thank you. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee, for the introduction of this session. Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Reina and I'm from Singapore. It gives me really great pleasure to be able to join all of you today, even if from a distance. So please allow me first to thank the organizers of this conference, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Korea, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and the Korean Society of International Law for your kind invitation to me to participate in this conference. Today, I'm speaking in my capacity as the president of the BBNJ Intergovernmental Conference. I'm sure many, if not all present today, know what BBNJ represents and the ongoing work at the UN for an international, legally binding instrument known affectionately amongst us as the ILB on the conservation and the sustainable use of biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. Our session today is entitled Promoting Biodiversity Beyond UNCLOS, and I observe that our mandate speaks of our work under UNCLOS, so I invite you to make what you will of that. I know that you are looking forward to hearing from our speakers. All of them are colleagues whom I've personally learned a lot from, and they have contributed much to our discourse on the new instrument in our quest to build a fair, balanced, and effective outcome. And they really need no introduction, so I will be brief, but their full bios can be accessed from the conference website. And I'm going to introduce all three speakers at once before we go into our presentations. So our first speaker will be Dr. Philomène VERLAAN. She is a visiting scientist with the Department of Oceanography at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. Dr. VERLAAN will be speaking about the interface of science and law, protecting, preserving, and conserving biodiversity with the Law of the Sea Convention, which segues quite nicely from yesterday evening's session on the role of scientific assessment. Dr. VERLAAN is uniquely qualified to speak about this topic as she is one of the rare few who is not only a lawyer, but also a scientist. So unlike a tyro like me, she actually understands the science. Dr. VERLAAN has participated in 25 ocean research expeditions and also specializes in the international law of the sea. And she will explore how science and law can operate together in building new treaties. Our next speaker will be Professor Joanna Mossop. She's a professor with the law faculty of the Victoria University of Wellington. She has undertaken research in several areas in the law of the sea, including maritime security, ocean governance, and the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles, the outcome of that last being an award-winning book. Recently, Professor Mossop has been focusing on the BBNJ negotiations, for which she has been an observer on the New Zealand delegation. Today, she will be speaking about dispute settlement in respect of areas beyond national jurisdiction. And incidentally, I held a webinar last night on the very same issue for BBNJ delegates, which is entirely coincidental, I assure you. But it was clear from the webinar that many delegations are placing a lot of emphasis on this topic. And I'd be particularly interested to hear Professor Mossop's thoughts on the interaction between compliance and dispute settlement. Our third speaker today will be Professor Kentaro Nishimoto of Tohoku University. Professor Nishimoto is not only responsible for the LLM program at the university, but he also conducts research and advises the Japanese government, including as an advisor to the Japanese delegation to the BBNJ negotiations. Professor Nishimoto will be sharing with us his thoughts on the promotion and regulation of marine scientific research for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity beyond national jurisdiction, and the implications of the new instrument on marine scientific research. So there's a lot for us to look forward to, and we will start with Dr. VERLAAN. So I will turn over the floor. I believe hers is a video presentation. So I will turn over the floor for her presentation. Professor VERLAAN, please.
Greetings from my time zone to yours. The organizers of this conference requested me to discuss challenges to the privileging of marine biodiversity over marine environment. This request arose from my invited eponymous chapter in this book. Now, the book's open access enables me to explore further here several ideas that I could only raise briefly in my chapter. The organizers asked me to present my thoughts in this session, whose title I have taken the liberty to borrow and adjust for my presentation. My reasons for this revised version of the session title are fundamental to and encapsulate a major argument of my presentation. Under current international law, so far, only the Law of the Sea Convention offers an adequate legal, scientific, and, crucially, internationally and nationally enforceable basis to address the causes of the existential crisis facing biodiversity. For present purposes, and pace the definition in the Convention on Biological Diversity, I provisionally define biodiversity as life on this planet, wherever it is found. The Law of the Sea Convention provides this basis because, in the case of the marine environment, it correctly, scientifically speaking, firmly situates this life in this environment. The Convention, equally scientifically correctly, requires protection and preservation of the marine environment. This is because life cannot be adequately protected on its own. The environment in which it is found must also be protected and preserved. The adjective marine is not added to biodiversity in my title. The Convention provides for environmental regulation of the non-marine environment, such as, for example, in Article 21 and Article 194. The Law of the Sea Convention also brings the atmosphere and the land, including rivers, within its purview when they serve as sources of pollution, as defined as you see here, of the marine environment. These sources states must prevent, reduce, and control. The laws and regulations that must be adopted and other measures that must be taken to achieve this end are, therefore, likely to benefit biodiversity and the environment in general, as well as marine biodiversity and the marine environment in particular. The environmental provisions of the Convention apply to high seas freedoms, including marine scientific research. The central importance of the marine environment as the setting within which potential or actual adverse effects of all activities must be considered under the Convention is further confirmed by the inclusion in those activities of all the high seas freedoms. Those freedoms are subject to the Convention's environmental provisions, which also apply to the freedom closest to my own seagoing heart, marine scientific research. The general principles, as you can see, are shown here, and it leads to this very important question: when does marine scientific research become marine environmental pollution? These two subclauses, B and D, lay the foundation for this question, with both scientific and legal ramifications that are not often considered. The governing body of the 1972 London Convention on the Prevention of Marine Pollution by Dumping of Waste and Other Matter, and its 1996 protocol, the LCLP for short, examined this issue in the context of ocean fertilization experiments being carried out on the high seas and in waters of national jurisdiction. I will expand on this in the last section of my presentation. The Law of the Sea Convention offers a planet-wide environmental coverage. This is unique so far among environmental treaties that aim to achieve various forms and types of environmental protection, including of biodiversity. Hence, I changed beyond to with, because without the Convention, the aims of these treaties are unlikely to be fully achieved, including for biodiversity that is not marine. I also changed promoting to protecting, preserving, and conserving for two reasons. First, promote is essentially a vague marketing term. As a matter of both science and law, it is difficult to find in promote any utility or relevance or applicability to biodiversity, no matter how biodiversity is defined. Promote appears often in treaties, where it is usually either not or at best poorly defined. Promote seems to fall in that vexed category of constructive ambiguities employed to help treaties towards acceptance and signature. However, the inevitable interpretation and implementation issues that such ambiguities raise are left for others to grapple with after the treaty is adopted. In environmental treaties, such ambiguities are often also scientifically meaningless, adding additional interpretation and implementation problems. The second reason is that the verbs protect, preserve, and conserve in various permutations are the three main operative terms used throughout the Convention to describe obligations imposed upon its parties with regard to the required care for both living and non-living parts of the marine environment. The Convention distinguishes between its use of protect and preserve and its use of conserve. As you can see here for protect and preserve, and the next slide shows you the meanings applied to conserve, which are, as you can see, numerous. Now, biodiversity fits in and is relevant to all of these categories. Hence, all three verbs must be used when considering the application of the requirements of the Convention, both to marine biodiversity in particular and to biodiversity in general. The foregoing discussion of my title concludes the first part and sets the scene for the remainder of my presentation. The absence of the word biodiversity in the Convention cannot be invoked to support an argument that the Convention does not protect, preserve, and conserve marine biodiversity. Its absence cannot be invoked to argue for a treaty that aims to protect only marine biodiversity, and then only in one particular part of the ocean that is defined solely by politically derived jurisdictional criteria that are devoid of any scientific basis or relevance to the protection of biodiversity. Such a treaty would be scientifically unsound. It is scientifically unsound because the protection, preservation, and conservation of biodiversity cannot be separated and preservation of the environment in which the biodiversity is found, on which the biodiversity is wholly dependent, with which the biodiversity is inextricably linked, and from which the biodiversity cannot be separated without losing its distinctive character and integrity. Article 194(5) of the Convention captures all these aspects. Biodiversity does not exist in a vacuum, not on land and not in the ocean. Neither do individual species exist in a vacuum. This includes Homo sapiens, also part of the biodiversity on this planet, albeit overlooked quite often. Species must exist in an environment without which they cannot exist at all. Even if the entire ocean were turned into a single, no-take, no-go marine protected area, biodiversity would still not be protected from the damage wrought by the ocean's increasing temperature, deoxygenation, and acidification caused by excessive greenhouse gas emissions. It would not be protected from the damage wrought by the burgeoning scourge of plastic. These are but two examples of the many forms of anthropogenic deleterious effects on a fully interconnected environment without any physical, natural barriers that can be erected to protect it as a whole, let alone a part of it. The COVID pandemic is but the latest manifestation of this lesson that humanity still seems to be unwilling to learn, let alone act on meaningfully to any extent. None of us is protected until all of us are protected. The same is true for the global environment, marine, terrestrial, and atmospheric. The Convention recognizes this fundamental reality of natural and physical connectedness of the oceans already in its preamble, as you see there. None of the environment is protected until all of the environment is protected. The Law of the Sea Convention enshrines this recognition in law by requiring protection and preservation of the marine environment, as well as its components, such as those listed earlier. These include later, that is to say post-1982, when the Convention was adopted, concepts such as those of biodiversity, despite the Convention not actually specifically naming biodiversity as such therein. It is really dispiriting that the transfer of the very useful biodiversity concept from the science to the law did not appear to bring with it the crucial insight that underpins the scientific understanding of biodiversity, namely the interconnectedness and intricate complexity of the web of life and its processes at a wide variety of temporal, spatial, and physical scales. Other than the highly welcome but still largely insufficient efforts to stop trying to manage only single species, most initiatives so far to protect biodiversity and legal instruments have not demonstrated a comprehensive awareness of this fundamental scientific insight and its practical consequences for environmental protection, let alone translated it into effective regulatory action. The growing trend to identify biodiversity hotspots as a focus for environmental management regimes also runs directly counter to the scientific insight of interconnectedness. So another conclusion here is to exercise huge caution when using scientific concepts in regulatory regimes. The Convention, however, itself is not perfect in every respect either. It has its own lessons to teach on the potential pitfalls of employing scientific concepts in legally binding instruments. Just because a concept can be elegantly expressed, and elegantly usually means simply, briefly, and clearly, does not necessarily mean that the concept is correctly understood and applied by those seeking to employ it outside of the scientific context in which it arose. Consider, for example, the Convention's Article 76. Its deceptively simple title, Definition of the Continental Shelf, impressively understates the intractable scientific and legal Gordian knots it contains. Article 76 may well be a collection of scientific and legal Gordian knots, but at least attempts to implement it are being made, as the heroic efforts of the Commission on the Continental Shelf demonstrate. More problematic is where clauses of the Convention appear to be, as far as I can ascertain, neglected, if not actively ignored, and certainly unimplemented. I address this in the last section of my presentation. Here I reflect on potential adverse effects on the rule of law and the development of sound science to support environmental treaties when implementation of treaty provisions for environmental protection is neglected. This is contrasted with two positive examples of where science and law have been working quite well on this complex interface. An especially worrying example from a marine environmental protection point of view is Convention Article 145 from Part 11 on seabed mining. The members of the International Seabed Authority, the ISA, have so far not addressed the legal and scientific ramifications for achieving marine environmental protection in accordance with the Convention in light of these two requirements, the inclusion of the coastline and interference with the ecological balance of the marine environment. No attempt has been made to define them. Given the focus of the present paper, consider the ecological balance concept set out in the Convention. This truly visionary idea succinctly and elegantly embodies the complexity and interconnectedness of the marine environment. Although it only appears in Article 145 and in Article 234 in ice-covered areas, it supports the argument the protection of biodiversity, no matter how it is defined, cannot be separated from protection of its environment. Nevertheless, neither in its exploration regulations and regional environmental management plans, nor in its current development of exploitation regulations, including extensive environmental impact assessment procedures, does the ISA address ecological balance. The ISA has not developed scientific research questions designed to obtain baseline data against which to establish the current nature and status of the ecological balance. It is really hard to see how scientifically and legally valid environmental impact assessments, let alone regional environmental protection plans, can be produced without these data. The continued neglect of this issue and the coastline and of Article 145b, just to be complete, has profound implications both for the rule of law, of which a mandatory operative part is not being applied, and for the sound science necessary to underpin that rule, for which the research is at present not being conducted. Dear colleagues, what do I tell my fellow scientists and my students when they point to Article 145 and ask me, why is it not being implemented by the ISA, which is specifically set up under the Convention to do exactly that? I am at a similar loss for an answer to similar questions from these interlocutors with regard to the adverse effects of greenhouse gas emissions on the marine environment. It has been evident for some time, at least where the marine environment is concerned, that greenhouse gas emissions are pollutants within the meaning of the first article of the Law of the Sea Convention. Furthermore, Part 12 provides ample authority and some mechanisms to deal with them. Yet the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and its subsequent protocols and conferences of the parties do not invoke the Convention. As shown again by the most recent Conference of the Parties in Glasgow, the states parties to the UNFCCC seem to consider that enforceable, decisive action to prevent, reduce, and control greenhouse gas emissions is legally optional. This may well be the case under the UNFCCC, but it is not the case under the Law of the Sea Convention, at least for its states parties. Insofar as Part 12 and Article 1 on marine environmental protection reflect customary international law, non-Law of the Sea Convention states parties are also obliged to act on greenhouse gas emissions under the Convention. The respect for the rule of law and the rule of law itself are being challenged on many fronts. The role of science in informing the law is crucial in many fields, and particularly so in the field of marine environmental protection. I highlight here two questions for further contemplation in this context. I would now like to turn to the contrasting positive examples that I promised. The LCLP, to which I referred above in Part 1, offer a long-standing and heartening treaty-based model for effective international intergovernmental cooperation in marine environmental protection between scientists and regulators. Central is the work of their dedicated scientific groups, which meet yearly for a week, about 6 months before the annual meeting of the governing bodies. The report of the scientific groups on the work entrusted to them by the governing bodies is always the first agenda item for the meeting of those bodies. The LCLP endeavor to ensure that their work is science-driven and that their regulations are science-based. When confronted with an emerging issue of marine environmental protection within their remit, the governing bodies, working closely with their scientific groups, develop the necessary regulatory instruments to address it. A particularly interesting legal and scientific example of this collaboration is the LCLP's response to marine geoengineering in particular, and ocean fertilization as a specific example. This resulted in, for example, the definition for the first time in international law of marine scientific research, which, as you will recall, like the marine environment, is not defined by the Law of the Sea Convention. The LCLP approach also provided a scientifically and legally sound basis, consistent with the Convention, to assess whether activities conducted at sea, including on the high seas, fall within the definition of pollution of the marine environment of Article 1 of the Convention, and were subject to the requirements of Part 12, as well as those of the London Protocol and Convention, despite being described by the proponents of ocean fertilization as marine scientific research and as a sacrosanct high seas freedom when conducted there. Another positive example is offered by the work of the International Maritime Organization on marine environmental protection from ship-based activities and vessel source pollution. In both treaty systems, much room for improvement remains, but as instructive indicators with decades of experience on how to regulate marine environmental protection effectively, much can be learned from them. I conclude by commending to your attention the Convention's Article 243, whose full potential for constructive interaction on the science-law interface remains unexplored. It is perhaps my favorite article of the Convention. It appeals to me as a marine scientist and as a law of the sea specialist, advocating for sound science to underpin the rule of law, and also as a humble human being trying to help keep our planet livable. It is almost never cited. Here it is, and I let it speak for itself. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Philomène, for sharing that. Clearly a case for lawyers and scientists to work together more closely and to talk more with each other.